Subcommittee will come to order. I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today as we examine what I think is a very important topic, the state of energy efficiency and resiliency in the design, construction, and operation of our federal buildings. It's appropriate we're having this hearing because this is High Performance Building Week, so what could be better than looking for high performance in our government buildings? The GSA owns and leases over 376.9 million square feet of space and approximately 9,600 buildings throughout the country. Having such a large real estate portfolio results in the enormous amount of energy consumption. We spend over $7 billion every year on utilities, and accordingly, we are the nation's largest energy consumer. We know our natural resources aren't infinite, so it's imperative that the government lead by example to achieve efficiency in construction and operation practices in buildings. Government action often sets the standard for best practices and innovation in the private sector as well, and successful and cost-neutral changes can have reverberating effects across the entire construction industry. Recent extreme weather events and natural disasters have demonstrated the importance of incorporating elements of resilience into our public buildings. With the increasing threat of climate change, it's now more important than ever that the federal government take preventive steps to curb its carbon footprint and ensure the long-term sustainability of our buildings. It's been some time since this subcommittee heard testimony regarding the greening of our public buildings. In fact, it was nearly a decade ago that the very first witness testified in front of this subcommittee on life cycle cost benefits and improved health of occupants in green buildings. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses what progress has been made and where we continue to lag behind and what we can do to address that. Third-party certification systems such as LEED, Energy Star, and Green Globes are used to assess how well green building principles are incorporated into a building's design and operation. So it's important that this subcommittee get a clearer picture of how those systems are perceived today and how they're being utilized by federal agencies. So thank you all for being here. In 2015, President Obama issued an executive order providing specific annual guidelines to significantly decrease energy consumption in our public buildings, to promote renewable energy use, and to incorporate resilient design elements into public building construction. That executive order, unfortunately, was rescinded under the Trump administration, and in its stead, the current administration issued Executive Order 13854, which states broad goals to achieve efficiency and resiliency. They aren't very meaningful standards, and what does exist dates back to 2007. We know a lot has changed since then. I look to our witnesses and hope that they can discuss what impacts this new executive order is having or will have on achieving our resiliency and efficiency goals. My colleagues and I are anxious to hear about progress from the witnesses, but we also want to understand how the existing state of regulation may be insufficient. This morning's hearing is an opportunity to examine what has and has not been effective and ensure that our government's sustainability efforts are rising to the significant challenges we face. This is a chance to look at the past accomplishments, the present situation, and our future goals. We have gone over time from a focus on green buildings to trying to also create healthy buildings and to the future need for smart and secure buildings. So we realize that as we try to achieve those goals and move across that path, we can be both responsible stewards of our environment and of taxpayer dollars. Those are not mutually exclusive goals. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to hearing from you. And I would now recognize Mr. Meadows, our ranking member, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I certainly appreciate your leadership on so many vital areas, and in a city where division is the headline of the day, I can tell you that your willingness to engage and take a leadership role should be applauded, and I applaud you. Certainly reducing costs and increasing efficiency in our federal real estate portfolio is a bipartisan issue. And this subcommittee has worked and will continue to work to ensure that the federal space is not only right-sized, but used efficiently, consolidated, and if not, is sold if needed. For example, just last week, my colleague, the fine gentleman, Mr. Pence, and I introduced some legislation to look at reform that will actually provide an additional tool to GSA in terms of replacing expiring leases with good deals for the American taxpayer and to expand the opportunities to consolidate and reduce space. And I'd like to thank the gentleman for his leadership on that particular area. These are not controversial issues, and yet many times the effective solutions seem to elude us in terms of reducing costs. It comes when we look at efficiency, we're looking at not only the efficiency of the lease space, but the energy and water consumption. It's also important that we apply those, really those processes and those solutions in other ways to reduce costs. But there are challenges that we must address. For example, nearly 50% of GSA's own building inventory is more than 50 years old. More than 50% of GSA's space is now in leased facilities, and there's limited funding for new construction. And if we're serious about building efficiency, then we must look at new ways of approaching the financing of federal facilities. Federal agencies already can take advantage of performance contracting, which provides a way to finance improvements by leveraging private dollars. However, these presume a building is already built and that there is funding for construction. And if we're serious about efficiency, then we should look at doing more in the public-private partnership side of things, as they are commonly called. Now, when we look at public-private partnerships, oftentimes those are looked at with a jaundiced eye from both sides of the aisle. But if we're looking at design build, and you're talking to someone who's in the real estate business, if we're truly looking at design build, there are real opportunities if we provide the flexibility of the federal government to allow these buildings to be constructed, ensure that they're efficient and maintained throughout the life of the building. Ultimately, our goal in building efficiency is really looking at the effectiveness and reducing costs. We must ensure solutions are in fact effective and that we aren't greening just to green. Now, I will say, having been in the private sector and having built commercial buildings, new construction generally is the best way to find, whether it's through the LEEDS program or others, is the best way to make sure that we're energy efficient. And yet, with our aging portfolio, we continue at times to pay higher water and higher electric costs, higher maintenance costs, and indeed it would be cheaper to have a new facility. And yet we sometimes don't look at the overall return on investment. Those solutions are something that would ultimately reduce the cost to the taxpayer. So to achieve this effectiveness and return on investment, there needs to be some flexibility and competition in those solutions. New space solutions are different than those for historic space. Office space is different than warehouse space or testing facilities, and we must ensure that there are standards that are flexible to allow the agency to have choices in those certifications as we meet those needs. GSA has a unique role in this regard. GSA provides recommendations government-wide, but also has the responsibility of improving efficiency in its own facilities. I can also say this, that the hodgepodge way that we do our federal portfolio drives me crazy. I can never figure out whether it's GSA's responsibility or the agency's responsibility or somebody else's responsibility. And so for me, you're going to find a very willing bipartisan support, even if it goes against perhaps some of the long-held principles that I might have. If we can find a way to be efficient and consolidate and make sure that we lower our costs, I am all in. So I look forward to hearing from the witness, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Sounds like we're on the same path, so I appreciate that. I'd now like to recognize Mr. DeFazio, who is the chairman of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee for his opening statement.
Thanks, Madam Chair. It has actually been, as you mentioned, it's been 10 years since this subcommittee held a hearing on energy efficiency in federal buildings, and it's long past time that we exert some oversight, look at progress that has been made, and look at new objectives. And you know, I would also echo some of the concerns of the gentleman who just spoke in terms of making more sense out of the federal government's portfolio and looking toward where we can make some upfront investments, whether it's through a P3 or other ways, that ultimately over the term of the occupancy, whether it's a lease option or an actual outright purchase, but when we're going to have net savings over time. So I think there is a lot of room for bipartisan consensus here. I was disappointed that this administration did rescind the order of President Obama's administration to have energy, water, and West net zero buildings by 2030. But GSA has actually had a couple of successes with some historic buildings, and if you can move a historic building in that direction without an inordinate investment, then I think we should be looking more and more at those and at all new acquisitions. I actually last week was at Oregon State University. We're hearing from the University of Oregon today, no offense to the U of O, but I was there and we were talking about earthquake resilience and retrofitting, and they've developed a new system that they're looking that they can retrofit our massive VA hospital in Portland to make it earthquake, not only survive an earthquake with the people inside, but to be functional afterwards. And making those sorts of investments in resilience and energy efficiency, I think, are very, very prudent. And we're also going to hear from Professor Kevin Van Den, and I'm going to get it right here, Weimelenberg. Is that pretty close? Okay, it's not the easiest. He's a professor of architecture at the University of Oregon, and he'll talk both about green buildings, energy efficiency, but he's also going to talk about resilience and something that's really just receiving attention, which is health, the health of the buildings that we work in and how they impact our productivity and our long-term health. And I think it's something that really has been overlooked over time, and it's something that needs more attention. So I look forward to the testimony, and I thank you for holding the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Graves and Dania. All right, well, at this time, I want to welcome our witnesses. On our first panel, Mr. Kevin Campshire, who is the Director of the Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings at the U.S. General Services Administration. I thank you for being here today. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Without objection, our witness's full statement will be included in the record. Since your written testimony will be made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. So welcome, Mr. Campshire, and please proceed.
Morning, Chairwoman Titus, and thank you, Ranking Member Meadows, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Kevin Campshire, and I'm the U.S. General Service Administration's Director for the Office of Federal High Performance Buildings and GSA's Chief Sustainability Officer. I appreciate being invited here today to testify about our work on efficiency and resilience in federal building design, construction, and operation. GSA's mission is to deliver value and savings in real estate, acquisition, technology, and other mission support services across the government. GSA manages over 371 million square feet of space, housing 1.1 million federal employees from 65 federal agencies. Congress created the Office of Federal High Performance Buildings in the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 to enable and enhance federal leadership in sustainable real property portfolio policy, management, and operations. Our office develops best practices, guidance, and tools for government-wide use to advance building innovations in planning, design, and operations that reduce costs and enhance human health and performance. High-performance federal buildings provide value for the taxpayer through life cycle cost benefits and positive effects on human health and performance. In a recent study comparing 100 GSA high-performance buildings to 100 GSA legacy stock buildings, the high-performance buildings used 23% less energy, 28% less water, 23% less money for building operations, and have 9% less waste, and still maintain 2% overall higher tenant satisfaction. Energy and water savings are even greater when compared to industry benchmarks, 43% lower for energy and 35% for water. By striving for annual improvement in energy and water efficiency, GSA has avoided over $600 million in energy and water costs over the past decade. GSA shares information, provides guidance, and assists agency in improving building performance through the federal management regulations and through tools such as the Sustainable Facilities Tool and Green Procurement Compilation, and by working with our federal partners and the private sector. Among these are the Interagency Sustainability Working Group with GSA co-chairs, the Chief Sustainability Officers Council, ASHRAE, NAESCO, and the American Institute of Architects, among others. GSA also tests new technologies in conjunction with the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and their national laboratories. Technologies that GSA has recently recommended for broader deployment include next-generation chillers, alternative water treatment technologies for cooling towers, LED upgrades for lighting, and low-E window retrofits. Over the past 5 years, GSA has deployed these and other advanced technologies in over 200 federal buildings, resulting in annual savings of over $7 million a year. One of the key areas of interagency collaboration is our review of high-performance building certification systems. ESA requires our office to complete a review of certification systems every 5 years and to provide our findings and recommendations to the Secretary of Energy. The Secretary then issues a rule to encourage comprehensive and environmentally sound approach to the certification of high-performance buildings within the federal sector. We evaluate the alignment of certification systems based on a list of criteria found in the 2014 DOE Certification System Rule, ESA, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and the Guiding Principles for Sustainable Federal Buildings. We are now completing our third review and plan to submit our recommendation to the Secretary later this year. Another area of interagency collaboration, one that affects the federal government more broadly, is planning for resilience. GSA works with other key agencies such as the Department of Health and the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to better understand infrastructure risk and methods for enhancing resilience and to safeguard federal investments. GSA incorporates resilience by integrating the latest building codes and methodologies into existing processes and standards and applying them in its capital investment leasing program. Each capital project is screened for multiple factors, including the observed weather extremes, expected long-term changes during the asset life, and the presence of core mission functions. High-performance buildings need to be operated as efficiently as possible, and Congress has recognized that there is a shortage of skilled building professionals needed to keep buildings operating at peak efficiency. GSA has fulfilled the requirements of the Federal Building Personnel Training Act of 2010 to consult with professional societies, industry associations, and apprenticeship training providers, and to identify, develop, and annually update core competencies. These are for building operations and maintenance, energy management, safety, and design functions. GSA has created an online tool that agencies can use to establish a training baseline and identify training needs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Putting all of these tools together will help the federal government to make strides in designing, operating, and maintaining high-performance federal buildings. And to support further investment in GSA's portfolio of buildings, I would ask that this committee support the President's fiscal year 2020 budget to fully fund GSA's repair and alteration request. This $1.6 billion funding level will allow GSA to address a portion of the $1.4 billion repair backlog, which will further improve the energy efficiency and performance of our buildings. I am pleased to be here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and I don't have any time to return. Sorry.
That's all right. Most people say I give back my time when they don't have any time anyway, so it's all right. But we thank you very much. We're going to move on now to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'd like to start by recognizing myself. Mr. Kapsher, you've been at this a long time, and as you laid out some of those statistics when you began, you've accomplished quite a lot. You've championed sustainability, and I want to thank you for that. A couple of things that you mentioned, though, I'd like to talk about a little more in detail because they kind of fit with FEMA and what we've been discussing in that subcommittee. When you assess the damage that's been done by flooding or tornadoes or hurricanes, and then you determine what changes we need to make to rebuild, can you tell us a little more about that process and how you are working towards making us more resilient? Because we found in the past, we just keep making the same mistake over and over again, and you keep building right back where it's going to be flooded or destroyed, and that just doesn't make good sense.
Thank you. Yes, we have changed in the last several years our processes for the initial selection of capital projects to require a comprehensive look at the site, the longevity, the expected life of the asset, and what's likely to happen at that particular site. And of course, that's very geographically specific. In addition, we're looking at making sure that all of the architects and engineering firms that are working on our projects have the proper credentials to be able to make good evaluations for how to design buildings that would last for the service life. And that includes looking at strengthening the enclosure, ensuring that the services can continue to operate, examining with the intended tenant of the building how we will react to a disaster, whether there are retreat options, what other backup facilities there will, and including looking at supply chain effects. We worked with one agency where we discovered that they could do everything in a storm, relocate elsewhere, and operate except for one little problem. They didn't have the bandwidth on their contract for electrical service, for Wi-Fi services. So looking at a comprehensive view of what we might do in different circumstances is the key. And in the case of rebuilding, obviously our first, after a disaster, our first goal is to get the government up and running, but then to look at the existing facilities and apply exactly the same criteria to them as we rebuild moving forward.
Well, I know we had $92 million for damages after the Hurricane Florence, and that's just for the federal building, so we want to be sure that money is put to good use.
Yes, and in fact, we're looking in that particular case to the most expensive thing that we experience is flooding, and this is the flooding result. So we're looking at making different decisions about how to protect the existing structures despite their presence in low-lying areas, so that we can either shed the water or make sure that it gets in and out more carefully. Moving, for example, electrical connections up higher so that they're not in the basement, and solutions like that.
Thank you. Another question I have is we often talk about what we do to the building itself, how to make it sustainable or energy efficient, but some of it has to do with locating the building. In many places around the country, outside of Washington, the location of a federal building has to do with development in that area. So how do we go about locating a building where it's close to transportation or helps a neighborhood or is close to the workforce? And once you decide the general area, how do you locate the building so that it's able to take advantage of the sunlight, for example?
That's it's obviously a very local decision across the country. We look at the presence of transportation. We look at how people get to and from building. That's part of our common evaluation. In places with no local transportation, we look at road services and the other ways that people can get to the building and how they can commute. That's part of the decision. We also look at how it is that we can, in building a new building, we have very strong daylighting requirements within the building. And in renovating old buildings, we're able to do that. In the chairman's district, the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt building, when the facade was replaced, we were able to have the building be daylit all day long in the entire occupied part of the building, including some areas of the basement that then has historically been cut off from light. Stop there.
So those are considerations that you would make with every building, both in new buildings and in renovated buildings. Well, thank you. I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Campshire, can you help me understand, I guess, the role of the Green Building Advisor Committee? I guess in that criteria, it talks about a process of adding non-federal members. for participation, and I guess I'm unclear on exactly how those non-federal members are added to that advisory board.
Thank you, sir. The Green Building Advisory Committee's non-federal members are specified in the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, mostly by category. So we have members who represent rating systems. We have members who represent the construction industry, architectural industry, engineering expertise, transportation expertise on there. In fact, our chair of the committee is from the New York MTA. We go through a process of every 4 years of reappointing people. We put out a Federal Register notice. We explain what the expertise we're looking for is. We ask for resumes. We evaluate those and then submit a recommendation to the Administrator of General Services, who makes the final selection. And then,
So I guess what I'm saying is, what is that criteria? Because you talked about reappointment. So does everybody just get reappointed, or how do you break into this club? And I see one of your staff shaking their head no. So I guess the answer is no.
actually,
She should never play poker, by the way. But go ahead. Oh, you're not staff. Oh, you're just shaking your head no. All right, go ahead.
so people have rotated off the committee. The last time there were 4 new members that joined the committee. So people leave and new people come on. The criteria we have, we look for expertise in the things that the Green Building Advisory Committee is charged with doing.
No, I get that. But who's the evaluator of that expertise, I guess is what I'm saying.
Oh, the staff of the GSA making recommendations to the administrator.
All right, and so if I were a non-federal member and I had, what's the best chances of me actually getting on that advisory committee? I mean, I put forth a resume and what, I mean, in the matrix, how do you get appointed to that? I mean, what's the top priority for getting included in that group?
Expertise on the work of the committee.
Having built buildings that are indeed.
Well, if they're representing of the construction industry, experience in building buildings, and
I guess what I'm looking for is if you can get to this committee, how do we make sure that we have a diversity of opinions as we do that? Because some things like boards are self-perpetuating, and that what they do is they end up patting each other on the back, and you get no new ideas coming, and there's been groundbreaking ideas in terms of how we make sure that we're more efficient. So can you get to this committee in the next 60 days or so, a plan on how and maybe you already are doing that, but how you would best make sure that we don't self-perpetuate?
I would be happy to do so, and I apologize for not explaining it well enough in the short time.
No, you're very kind, and actually we're not in a confrontational kind of situation here. I just want to make sure that I understand it. So in terms of updating the P100 facilities, why is my understanding that there's only one certification system that's there? Why would that be? Why has that not been updated? Am I correct in that?
That is correct. The P100 is used by GSA as its standard for federal buildings. In our recommendations that we made 5 years ago on high-performance building rating systems, we recommended that for each portfolio, an agency select one and use that one rather than have multiple systems. It's an efficiency measure more than anything else. And in GSA's case, the Public Building Service determined that the LEED was the one that was most familiar to GSA employees who had to enforce it, and to the construction industry who were bidding on our projects.
And so, and I get that as being most familiar, but it wasn't too long ago that Blackberries were most familiar to everybody, and I don't know that you can find one on Capitol Hill now. And so I guess what I'm saying is as we look at that, again, I'm looking for a diversity of opinions and the ability to make sure we're efficient and effective. When will the P100 be updated next?
It's moved actually from a periodic updating to a continuous updating cycle now, so it gets updated frequently. So there's no particular brand new P100 version 12 So it gets updated almost every month with some.
So it could change tomorrow.
It could, it probably will.
All right, I yield back. Thank you.
I'd now like to recognize Ms. Davids for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and to Mr. Campshire for being here today. I appreciate your testimony, and I applaud the GSA for its leadership in developing new building code standards for federal buildings. And I'm particularly intrigued by the information you provided around resilient building. As the Chairwoman noted already, with increases in large weather events and climate change being indisputably a real and daunting challenge for our time, there's no action too small to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And we need to use every tool at our disposal. And I think this committee can make it easier for agencies like yours to play a significant role in that mitigation. So I'm from the Kansas 3rd Congressional District, which is encompasses all of Johnson County, Wyandotte County, and I think a lot of times people think of coastal cities when they think about climate change, but the Weather Channel ranked our region, the Kansas City area, as the 5th in the top 25 list of U.S. cities to be most impacted by climate change. We're certainly an important area for purposes of our nation's infrastructure and transportation. Our city will see, our metro area is going to see 20 more days above 90 degrees, which is, it'll be more than the rural counterparts, and we have a lot of drought concerns coming up. And then with heavy rains that are occurring, our region has a lot of flooding issues as well. I guess I want to hear a bit about how the process for information gathering prior to or during the design phase, like prior to the building, but during the design phase, what's the process for factors that you take into account there?
So before we even get to design phase, when we're selecting projects and developing the prospectus and developing the contract, we work very closely with FEMA, in particular, the Army Corps of Engineers, with their experience, NASA, and other agencies, mostly in the Department of Homeland Security. That's where we get the most up-to-date standards. That's where we get the most up-to-date information about forecasts for long-term events. So we look at, and it's very geographically specific, so we look at where we are in the country, what we're likely to have to deal with, and we look for the long term, because most new buildings that GSA builds, we assume, are going to be functional for 100 years. So we're looking at 100 years using the science assessments of what's going to happen in that area. And as you mentioned, it's very geographic specific. We worry about flooding because that's the most expensive to recuperate from. But we've actually worked with people in the Midwest, our clients, who are operating computer centers that won't operate without water. And in extended periods of drought, how do you deal with that? How do you do that? So we look at different options for cooling, different options for designing backup systems for data centers and that. And we do all of that before the building starts. Then we put those things into the specifications, and they become a part of the selection criteria for the teams that we hire that actually do the design and construction of facilities.
Thank you. And one of the things, I think part of the reason that I'm so interested in this is because under the benefits section of your testimony, I was very excited to see the 23% lower building operating expenses that you noted. I mean, of course, I'm excited about the 23% lower energy and the lower water usage and that sort of thing, but I guess how do you marry up the potential cost savings with the all that work that you put in with the other agencies? How do you marry those things up when you're looking for when you're looking at the design and the building function? And then also, can you tell me, do you use a design build construction risk manager at risk? What kind of?
If I could start with that one, because it's one of the things that we have learned is the efficacy of design build or design build like we also use something called design build bridging, both of which are very effective. We did some studies of particularly effective buildings to look at what made those projects so successful. And the answer was integrated design, making sure that everybody was at the table, making sure that when the architects and engineers were thinking about buildings, we had the building manager who was going to operate the building in the room, contributing to that, as well as the people who are building it. The diversity of ideas in teams that are developed with integrated design principles is the most important factor in success there. And to get back to your savings question, we assume that we can get savings because we know we can do that, so we just keep watching for it as we go through the building, through energy models and the like. I mentioned the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt building. They did over 30 energy models during the course of design just to make sure that the building would operate as well as it does today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now recognize Mr. Pence for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus and Ranking Member Meadows, and nice to meet you, Mr. Kampscher. Thank you for being here today. The Energy Efficiency Improvement Act of 2015 directed GSA to develop model leasing provisions related to energy and water efficiency measured in leased space. GSA space is now more than 50% leased. While we have been working to reduce those costs through consolidation and positioning GSA to negotiate better deals, as Congressman Meadows mentioned, we have seen the cost of lease space increase. How does GSA ensure the taxpayer realizes the savings in the rental rates of lease space from efficiency requirements?
Well, to your first point, we actually did publish the model lease provisions, and we had them vetted with a number of different private sector entities, and we use those provisions in our own leases. And in fact, we based in many cases the model lease provisions on what GSA had been developing over the years. Leasing is a competitive process, and it's like all real estate, a combination of location, functionality, size, and future benefit to the occupants of the building. I think that I would defer further questions on how that competitive process goes. It doesn't happen to be my particular area of expertise, if I may.
Okay. Thank you. I yield my time.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will so yield.
Yeah. So let me follow up on one particular, because you mentioned one area that really is a pet peeve of mine. When we look at leasing overall, the residual value of a building, GSA doesn't really get to figure that in. So if you're actually leasing a building and being able to purchase that building at the end of that contract, there are constraints on that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
How can you compare to the private sector then? I guess the question for me is because in the private sector, what we would do if we go out and lease something, we would actually have a lease, and if it was a lease purchase, we'd have a residual value. Sometimes that's $1, sometimes that's market value at the time. How do you compare to the private sector when indeed you can't even enter into a contract that's the same as the private sector?
We have done a number of studies that compare the federal construction to private sector construction by taking into account those differences. Obviously, we don't pay
Well, in terms of cost, I get that because you have those parameters. But in terms of lease costs, you're comparing apples to oranges. Wouldn't it be better if we were able to find an apple-to-apple comparison to allow residual values to that if we're leasing a building and we can purchase it for $1, let's put it in a car terms. In automobile terms, you can have a lease on a car with a zero residual, or you can have a lease on a car that has a $10,000 residual, and yet the lease payments will be very different on those two automobiles. And so how do you compare the two? And I guess that's what happens in the private versus federal. Would it not be helpful if you were given greater flexibility in that to be able to make sure that we're efficient for the American taxpayer? It's not a trick question.
No, I know it's not a trick question. It's also a question that's not, I'm not quite current in all of the flexibility that the government does have, so I'd actually prefer to.
I yield back, and I thank the chairman's courtesy.
We appreciate that, Mr. Campster. We're here to talk about energy efficiency. The topic of leasing versus building and all that GSA does is what could be a whole nother hearing. Maybe we can bring the director in to address some of those questions. So we'll get back to energy efficiency and resilience and that sort of thing. So I now recognize Ms. Holmes Norton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. A very important hearing, but I would simply like to go on record before asking my questions to thank you, Madam Chair, for joining me in sending a letter last month to the Financial Services Appropriations Subcommittee to request that they restrict GSA's ability to use funds to assist in the implementation of USDA's plan to relocate two agencies, the Economic Research Agency and the National Institute of Food Agriculture, out of the Washington, D.C. area. I very much appreciate your help in this respect. It's an attempt to use GSA's leasing authority without having moved through the standard GSA procurement process. The other committees and members, including the entire House and Senate Capital Region delegation, have noted this problem. And Madam Chair, I would ask that you consider a hearing in our subcommittee on GSA's role in facilitating USDA's relocation proposal. It is an attempt to get around this subcommittee as well as the standard procedures. And I would appreciate very much your considering that, Madam.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention again.
I have a question on the implementation of President Trump's Executive Order 13834. I'm trying to figure out where it stands now in relation to a prior executive order. The executive order says it does want to increase efficiency and eliminate unnecessary use of resources, protect the environment. So all of the upfront language is what you might expect, but it does not set specific energy, water, or greenhouse gas reduction targets. And it repeals the Obama-era executive order, which specifically required such targets. Its target was to reduce building energy intensity by 2.5% annually. Now, I can understand perhaps this administration disagrees with that, but it's got a new executive order. And so I must ask you, if you believe that the Trump executive order actually repeals specific performance targets, and if it does, how will you know that there has been any reduction in energy consumption?
Thank you, Congressman. The executive order whose implementing instructions were just issued a couple of weeks ago requires the same degree of reporting on all of those factors, and it also...
Well, the degree of reporting, anyway, so what do the agencies report?
We're reporting on energy intensity, water intensity over time. Greenhouse gases are still reported, and they still appear on the OMB scorecard of agencies. What has changed is the flexibility with which individual agencies have to set targets for reduction. What is required is a reduction.
And how will you know if there's a reduction, and why do you think there do not need to be targets, sir? What do they need? What are they aiming for? If they reduce it a tiny bit, that's okay with GSA. If they reduce it a great deal, what do they get for that? What was the point in erasing specific targets. Perhaps you have another target. Perhaps you think the 2.5% is too great. Why then not have at least your own administration target?
Well, every agency sets an internal target and reports that in an annual plan, which is reviewed by the Council of Environmental Quality.
So the executive order does instruct them to agency by agency set targets and report them to GSA.
To report them to the Office of Management and Budget and the Council of Environmental Quality.
Madam Chair, I would ask that any targets set, which are not clear in the executive order, by the way, be also reported to this subcommittee. I yield back.
Thank you. If you could help us with that, we'd appreciate it, Mr. Kamsher. I now recognize Ms. Miller for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus and Ranking Member Meadows, and thank you for being here today. In your testimony, you mentioned that the GSA's investment in next-generation building technology is based on actual performance, financial payback, and real-world demonstration. The GSA will then recommend deployment only after these technologies have demonstrated positive results. What technological resources has GSA recommended for deployment in the federal facilities?
I mentioned new efficiency chillers. We did a series of studies of magnetic levitation chillers. They have much lower friction. We found them to be almost universally an improvement. We've recommended those. We've recommended several different kinds of LED lighting systems over the years. We have just, if I can get a plug to Congressman Meadows' earlier question, the Green Building Advisory Committee has recommended to us to take a look at, in particular, what we think is a very exciting new technology, which is the integration of buildings with grid, the grid integrated buildings, and we're working closely with the Department of Energy to do a pilot project on that. I think it's very exciting. It's sort of the next generation there. We have looked at high efficiency boilers, and then I think the other three areas which we've done, we think are very worthy of investment are water and sewer savings, get a very high payback, control systems, because the changes in control systems have made, and the presence of advanced meters have made the analysis of what goes on buildings much more effective than it was a decade ago.
And even things like newer windows?
Windows are the most difficult energy improvement to make cost-effective in a reasonable time. But yes, it includes new windows, low E-glass paintings. We've looked at, and in fact, the building I work in has a roof that has electrochromic glass. It's one of the first installations on the East Coast with electrochromic glass because it was actually the cheapest way to cool the space, much cheaper than sort of physical canvas coverings and shades and so on.
Okay, so what is the timeline for the testing of the technology following the installation of these operations?
We usually test, and if I could back up 1 second, we look at the Department of Energy for ideas and sort of the laboratory testing of buildings, and then ourselves and the Department of Defense test them in actual buildings. We work with the national laboratories to do usually a year-long test of equipment in situ, so we get the experience on all 4 seasons.
Okay, thank you. And can you speak to GSA's goals for the upcoming year on continuing to implement analysis-based evaluations that you've been talking about?
Yes, I mentioned our focus this year is on selecting 1, 2, perhaps even 3 pilots on grid-integrated buildings. We're looking at a combination of finding the right building plus a cooperative utility, because you can't do this without a utility, and plus rates that are conducive to make this change. So grid-integrated buildings make the most sense where you have significant swings in time-of-day pricing, cheap energy in the middle of the night and expensive energy in the afternoon, where you can make those adjustments to the grid operator and conceivably reduce the overall cost of the grid and increase the reliability of the grid, which actually gets the utility interested in the project.
Thank you. And would you please humor me and tell me the name of those windows again and how they operate?
Electrochromic glass windows operate by reacting to the amount of sunlight that hits them and then changing color automatically. They require a little trickle of electricity. In our installation, we have a couple of translucent solar panels that provide that trickle of electricity on the same roof.
Okay, thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Don't you also work with the Department of Energy sometimes to put solar panels over covered parking in buildings?
We have done that, and in fact, in a energy project that we did under the ESPC authority right in New Carrollton, we found that the most cost-effective way to install the solar component was to cover the parking, which has sort of the very nice side effect of making the cars of the people who work in the building much cooler at the end of the day, and it also supplies over 20% of the electricity of that building. I might add that that is a wonderful case study of an energy performance savings performance contract. We achieved over 62% actual energy savings. It's been in operation for 4 years, and it continues to outperform the predictions.
Thank you. Now I recognize Ms. Fletcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus, and thank you, Ranking Member Meadows, for holding this important hearing today. Thank you, Mr. Kampscher, for taking the time to testify. Management of federal buildings throughout the country is no easy undertaking, and I want to talk just a little bit about some of the goals and objectives that have been set. The Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 established the Office of Federal High Performance Buildings to develop best practices, guidance, and tools for government-wide use to reduce cost, enhance human health and performance, and minimize environmental impacts, as you know. GSA has driven improvements to the efficiency of federal buildings through this office, which has been a large success story. Energy efficiency at federal buildings is vastly improved from where we were a decade ago. I do, however, worry that some aspects of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 have not spurred the desired outcome that was envisioned when the law was enacted. Section 433 of the Energy Independence and Security Act calls for the elimination of all fossil fuel generated energy from federal buildings by 2030. With the growth that we've seen domestically in natural gas over the last decade, I'm not sure this provision has the desired environmental effect that was intended. Natural gas plants replacing coal-fired plants in the power sector have been the greatest factor in reducing carbon emissions to levels we haven't seen, the lowest levels in the last 20 years. But we now have a statute saying that by 2030, there'll be no natural gas used in federal buildings. This is counterintuitive to addressing carbon emissions, and so I want to ask you a couple questions that go to that issue. Number one, can you tell me what percentage of federal buildings currently rely on fossil fuel generated energy?
In GSA's inventory, it's virtually all of them.
And as I think you know, the 2007 Act sets targets for fossil fuels at 80% of all federal buildings being fossil fuel free by 2020. Is this target a realistic one that you expect to meet?
As we build new buildings, we are taking that target into effect on in the buildings that we bring into the inventory, and we are currently achieving the targets that are set in statute.
Well, that applies to new buildings, but for existing inventory, I think you just told me virtually all of the buildings rely on fossil fuels. So do you think that a policy focused on energy efficiency and reduction of carbon emissions at federal buildings, rather than the elimination of all fossil fuels, but instead having a fuel source neutral effort to reduce our overall carbon footprint, would be a better way to foster the environmental mandate?
In my personal opinion, if the goals are very clear, having greater flexibility in the means of achieving them is usually the better way to achieve those goals.
And just just to be clear, we're talking about a goal. All the buildings right now rely to some extent on fossil fuels to power them. And we're talking about a reduction by 2020, about 80%. That target's not achievable.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Would you agree with me that the target of reducing fossil fuels, 80%, is not achievable by 2020?
I would agree with you that it's a very difficult goal.
And would you agree with me that it makes sense to revisit the goals and instead of reducing fossil fuels, instead focusing on carbon emissions and reducing emissions?
I'm sure that we would be very happy to provide an opinion to this committee on proposed legislation that would talk about the practicality of achieving the legislation that was drafted.
I think that would be very helpful. I think one of the things that we should strive to do on our committee is set achievable targets. And from your testimony today, I don't think the goal for 2020 or for 2030 seem like they are in sight. So I thank you for your testimony this morning. I look forward to getting additional information from you. And I see that my time is running out. So with that, I will yield back.
Thank you. Now I recognize Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Campshore, I want to go a little bit different direction. There was a report that came out that said, it's been a few years ago, that there were 77,000 empty or underutilized federal buildings. I know that we're, on the energy side, spending some amount of money to maintain those buildings. Doesn't it make sense, wouldn't it make more sense for us to sell those buildings, get them out of the federal inventory and get them off the books in terms of what we're expending?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I would agree with the premise that buildings that are underutilized can save the most amount by being renovated so that they can be more intensively used. In the building, in GSA's headquarters, for example, we increased the number of people in the building after the modernization of the building by over 40%, and we're avoiding $32 million a year in avoided lease costs by reducing the amount of leasing, moving people into the building. It's also interesting that we studied two buildings, the one I work in here in Washington, D.C., and a building in Denver, Colorado, that have that kind of density. And when you increase the density by 40%, the electrical consumption of the building only goes up by 4%. So it's also an energy efficiency component there. And it's certainly true that the square foot of space that you don't use at all has the greatest savings compared to one that's more efficient.
Right. Well, Mr. Meadows made this point about buildings that are over 50 years old. Here's an article from National Public Radio about empty buildings, and there's one in particular. Now, this is from 2014, so I don't know what has happened with this building. It's a 132-year-old building that's just 6 blocks from the White House that's sitting empty. And the point I'm trying to make is that if you've got property that's underutilized, you're still paying to keep it heated and cooled. It might make more sense to sell those buildings, let somebody else bear the cost of doing the modernization of the building to reduce the energy footprint, but or rather than the federal government do that. Then you've got this report from the GAO from March of last year on space utilization. I just think that's got to be part of the discussion when we're talking about reducing our overall energy cost. Is better utilization of the properties that we have and maybe disposal of the properties that we don't need. And I think that needs to be part of the conversation.
I think that's an important thing, sir, and it's also something that GSA is supporting government-wide. In the past several years, if I recall, I may have this statistic a little bit off, we've reduced the overall federal inventory by over 3 million square feet, $3 billion, and there is a very active program to reduce the total footprint of the government, and I'd be happy to provide you some more information about that program.
Well, there's a little bit of frustration involved here because the GAO placed the handling of federal buildings on its high-risk list, and it's been on there since 2003. And I think now that we've got this major focus on energy and going to renewables and being more efficient, that now would be a good time to start implementing some of the suggestions that the GAO has made. Obviously, there's some major complications with selling federal property that I think we need to work through. But when you're talking about buildings, particularly older buildings, as Mr. Meadows brought up, and he's been a developer. I worked for 2 international engineering companies, so I think it'd be in our best interest if we took a holistic view of this and started looking at property that's underutilized or unoccupied and make some decisions there that would help us reduce our energy footprint. With that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Palmer. I would also remind this committee that during the last session of Congress, when it was chaired by Mr. Barletta, he was very concerned about this, and we were working towards this and had several hearings on how to reduce that footprint and move away from some of the old buildings, sell some instead of renting, building. So we can get some of that information from previous hearings to the committee and see where we want to go from there. Because I think some progress has been made as a result of those hearings, and we'll see what might be next. Thank you. We're done with this. Thank you very much for being with us. It's been very enlightening. We appreciate your expertise and your commitment to this. Thank you for spending time this morning.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
I would now ask the second panel to come forward. Well, thank you very much for being here and welcome. Our next panel of distinguished guests include Dr. Kevin Vanden Wy Mellenberg, from henceforth known as Dr. Vanden Wy, who is the Director of Energy Studies and Buildings Laboratory at the University of Oregon. Ms. Elizabeth Beardsley, who's the Senior Policy Counsel, U.S. Green Building Council, and Mr. Mark Russell, the Green Globes Assessor from the Green Building Initiative. We thank you for being here today. We look forward to hearing your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. As with Mr. Kamsher, since your written testimony has been made part of the record, we would request that you limit your oral testimony to just 5 minutes. So we'll proceed with Ms. Beardsley.
Thank you. Chairman Titus, Ranking Member Meadows, and members of the subcommittee. I'm greatly honored to join you today on behalf of the U.S. Green Building Council. USGBC is a nonprofit organization dedicated to transforming the way buildings and communities are designed, built, and operated, enabling an environmentally and socially responsible, healthy, and prosperous world. We're best known for our successful leadership in energy and environmental design, LEED, Green Building Rating System. Through LEED and initiatives such as education and events, we drive sustainable and high-performing buildings that improve the quality of life for all. Federal progress in building efficiency and sustainability over the past decade has been significant. We offer these highlights of our recommendations for strengthening and expanding upon this progress. First, federal agency targets for key metrics such as energy and water intensity, renewable energy, and efficiency investment such as performance contracting have been important and successful levers and could be brought forward to ensure all agencies continue to benefit from efficiency. Federal energy efficiency performance standards are another area where updating could increase savings. Ensuring adequate continued funding for the GSA Office of Federal High Performance Buildings and for the Federal Energy Management Program, FEMP, within the Department of Energy is also critical for progress. Additional advances in federal building sustainability and cost savings could be made through enhancing resiliency activities, updating key contracting provisions, and improving energy-efficient leasing implementation, as well as reestablishing federal floodplain guidelines. To provide additional context on who we are and our partnership with the federal government, USGBC has more than 9,000 diverse business, organizational, and government members. More than 200,000 individuals around the globe hold LEED credentials, including government professionals and veterans, for whom this is available through the GI Bill. Since its establishment, LEED has become the most successful voluntary, consensus-based, high-performing green building program in the country, with more than 64,000 commercial and institutional LEED-certified projects in the U.S. alone. The private sector has embraced LEED in recognition of its strong business case. Green buildings can save money on a life cycle basis as energy and water savings pay back quickly and add value. Numerous econometric studies have found evidence of the economic benefits of LEED and Energy Star, including improvement in net operating income and value premiums for rents and sales. Businesses also understand that their biggest investment is in the human resources that work in those buildings. High-performing green buildings have been shown to support improved employee productivity as compared with conventional buildings by providing spaces that are comfortable with air quality that promotes health, focus, and cognitive function. In the federal sector, the GSA is a leader in implementing energy and water efficiency across its large federal buildings portfolio to provide high-performing spaces, saving money, and supporting federal employees. Through construction and leasing policies, performance contracting, and other public-private partnership models and use of third-party certification, GSA has saved many millions of dollars, as you've just heard directly from GSA. LEED is among the private sector tools GSA and federal agencies use to meet their goals for public facilities. Across more than 20 agencies and departments, the federal government has certified over 5,000 LEED projects representing nearly 290 million gross square feet. GSA has repeatedly found LEED to align well with federal goals as part of its statutory review of green building systems. LEED also supports federal resilience, as found with a recent study from UT San Antonio, for example. We've been increasing our focus and tools for resilience as well, with pilot resilience credits in LEED and a new resilience-focused rating system known as RELY. The GAO has also affirmed federal agency benefits from green building systems. GAO reported third-party certification helps agencies ensure compliance with their requirements by holding contractors and agency project teams accountable, and GAO had no recommendations from this review. Federal agencies' use of high-performing buildings can also spill over, spurring innovative building science and technology, and has enabled a thriving industry with an export market now valued at almost $40 billion. Thank you for the opportunity to provide these remarks, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Good morning. I want to thank Chairman DeFazio, Chairwoman Titus, Ranking Member Meadows, and all the members of the committee for this opportunity. As was mentioned, I direct the Energy Studies and Buildings Lab, but additionally, I direct the Biology in the Built Environment Center and an institute called the Institute for Health in the Built Environment. Together, we're a group of designers and scientists from multiple institutions that partner with groups in industry in a program we call Build Health. And together, our goal is to look for the synergies between energy efficiency and healthy indoor environments. Today, I want to emphasize that a vision of resiliency that encompasses human health indoors and unleashes the power of integrated design is the key to unlocking deeper energy savings while also promoting health indoors. Why does resilience in buildings matter? Americans spend over 90% of our lives in buildings. After decades of increasing lifespans, now we see declines. We're spending more on healthcare than other industrialized countries, yet our quality of life and our life expectancy is decreasing. Evidence is mounting that indoor environments impact human health outcomes. You may have heard of sick building syndrome and thought we fixed that a couple decades ago. But maybe more recently, you've experienced headaches from background noise, from traffic, or a building fan whirring. And the WHO has connected those kind of impacts to cardiovascular and metabolic health implications. Or maybe you've had a child or a grandchild come home from daycare and with a rapidly transmissible virus that wreaked havoc in your home, or maybe you got sick, or a loved one you had got sick when they went to the hospital, the very place they were meant to go get healthy. So indeed, indoor environments impact human health. So how are we doing on energy efficiency? Certainly, we've made tremendous progress in efficiency. Lighting and HVAC technologies, secondary glazing systems, smart windows, smart building infrastructure software. Many of these innovations funded by the Department of Energy, implemented through GSA, and then supported with public utility investments. Recently, we worked with a group called the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance and Seattle City Light to pilot the first pay power purchase agreement for energy efficiency. It's typically used for rooftop solar. These efforts, though incredibly important, have only slowed the growth of energy consumption in the United States. I'll argue that we need more leverage. We spend $1 on energy, and for every dollar we spend on energy, we spend $100 on employees. We need to focus on people. We need to focus on improving the health and wellness of people in buildings, and we need to make sure that we pull increased energy efficiency along for the ride. So what is a resilient building? You might think of a resilient building as passive survivability, this idea that under a power outage, that people can have access to light and air and still occupy a building safely. But we need a grander vision that I'll call passive thrivability. This idea is that resilient buildings can improve the health of occupants, regenerate the health of the planet, produce more energy than is consumed, and support a healthy bottom line for the businesses that operate within them. It's a grand vision, but the good news is we have 2 or 3 decades of lessons that can be learned from our efforts in energy efficiency market transformation that can be brought to bear. We've learned that we need ingenuity and innovation, we need incentives and investments, we need policy and education to sustain that innovation. This can be complex or really quite simple. When we put people next to an operable window, they get an access to views of nature, they get abundant daylight, they get access to fresh air when they think they need it, and these have all been associated with increased health outcomes. Circadian entrainment, supporting healthy sleep-wake cycles, accelerated stress recovery, and reduced exposure to indoor toxicants. This elegant strategy also can save tremendous amounts of energy. This is passive thrivability. I encourage the committee to consider the following recommendations. I suggest we need to capitalize on the investments that we've made over decades in energy efficiency, document the persisting energy savings, establish reinvestment mechanisms, and research the associated non-energy benefits of health and comfort, such that we can drive these investment mechanisms for deeper energy savings and improved health. At the University of Oregon, we call this approach to this program BTUs for BTUs, or building tune-ups for reduced energy savings, BTUs. We're developing metrics for non-energy benefits, developing institutional performance verification strategies, and reinvestment plans. We're expanding this with a campus-wide building resilience initiative. In closing, I'd like to suggest that federal buildings have a well-established tradition of serving as agents of change in our built environment, and the lessons that we've learned in the last decades on energy efficiency can be applied to our new vision for resiliency. Thank you.
Dr. Russell?
Thank you, Chair Titus, Ranking Member Meadows, and the committee for this chance to share some information about GBI and Green Globe's experiences working with the federal government on sustainability projects. I am Mark Russell, a professional engineer with a background in government construction and building rating systems. As a Green Globes assessor, I have completed 44 federal Green Globes and guiding principles compliance projects and have 22 additional federal projects in progress. I'm appearing here on behalf of the Green Building Initiative. GBI is a 501c3 company which owns and operates the Green Globe Sustainable Building Certification System. Green Globes offers 4 levels of certification using a 1,000-point system. Points are weighted across the criteria to drive users toward best practices in areas such as energy, water, and materials. Green Globe's process also requires third-party assessment by a Green Globes assessor. Assessors, like me, conduct oversight of each project and conduct a final on-site assessment at completion to ensure that the building has earned its certification level. Green Globes also offers a not applicable feature that allows projects to identify criteria that do not apply to their buildings. NAs are approved by assessors and allow unique projects, like many undertaken by the federal government, to complete Green Globe certification without being penalized for lack of compliance with criteria that do not apply to them. For example, a museum that cannot allow windows and daylighting in most of its space due to the need to preserve artifacts is not penalized for failure to have adequate energy-efficient windows. GBI also offers a program called Guiding Principles Compliance, designed specifically for use by the federal government. In 2015, GBI introduced a DoD-specific GPC version that combines the DoD Unified Facilities Criteria and the Interagency Sustainable Working Group's Guiding Principles into one program. These programs help departments and agencies to confirm compliance with federal guiding principles requirements for sustainability. The GSA in 2013 and again in a 2019 review recommended Green Globes for use by the federal government. GBA has long supported the idea that the federal government should encourage competition in the marketplace as it relates to federally approved certification systems. As a significant marketplace customer, the federal government should have choices among certification systems to identify those that best meet the needs of the many unique projects and the government undertakes. Encouraging certification systems to compete helps the government ensure it is getting what it needs on projects, attaining a good cost benefit for taxpayers on certification, and encouraging systems to continue to evolve to meet future needs. Since 2014, over 600 federal projects have been certified under Green Globes, and 104 federal projects are in progress. In all, over 750 federal building certifications have been done through GBI. We have worked with a broad scope of federal buildings, including projects such as courthouses, data centers, laboratories, and VA hospitals. As an assessor, I've encountered many interesting federal projects that use creative methods for energy savings, such as a VA facility in Oregon that uses an ice plant to create an ice reservoir that is then used during the day to cool the facilities. We continue to see federal project teams make great progress in improving their buildings. Repeat clients often demonstrate significant enhancements in subsequent buildings, and the use of the certification program helps to organize and guide federal teams. Building performance improvement helps to provide long-term savings to taxpayers as a result of energy and water savings and increased workforce productivity. In follow-up with federal teams, they indicate that they see positive impacts to the operational costs resulting from the sustainability measures incorporated into the buildings. Government teams also have an increasing interest in understanding how occupant health, wellness, and effectiveness is influenced by their buildings, supporting a desire to provide buildings that are pleasant to work in and lead to more efficient and productive work environments. This interest has helped to encourage the evolution of certification systems, which are now looking more closely at indoor environment criteria. Building resilience continues to be an important concept, but one that still needs further discussion and definition. This is a great challenge ahead in determining how to establish which federal buildings need to be resilient to which disasters or challenges. As part of the Guiding Principles Compliance certification, we require the project team to identify potential impacts as part of the design process. And Green Globe's new ANSI update includes a building risk assessment that attempts to identify resilience priorities. In conclusion, improving the performance of federal buildings stands to have ultimate benefit for operational costs, government workers, productivity, and also taxpayers who benefit from the cost savings generated by a more nimble, energy-efficient, and sustainable federal portfolio. The Green Building Initiative has greatly enjoyed its ongoing collaboration with the federal government on hundreds of projects, and we look forward to assisting the federal teams as they improve federal buildings and spaces to address better performance, sustainability, resilience, and savings for American taxpayers. Thank you for this opportunity to provide our thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. I'm encouraged to hear all of you with a positive commitment to doing even more, but also with recognition that a lot has been done, and so that's encouraging. We'll now have questions. I'll recognize each of the members for 5 minutes of questions and begin by recognizing myself. We know a good bit about how to make buildings greener and more energy efficient, less so about how to make them healthy, and even less about how to make them smart when we talk about the development of artificial intelligence and internal security. You're a very forward-thinking architect, Mr. Vanderwey. Will you please give us some specifics about how to make buildings more healthy? I know I am frustrated by the Russell building because I can't open my windows. I just want to open that window for some reason. Would you just talk about that a little more?
Sure. Well, and I think in its simplicity, opening a window and having access to fresh air is a great starting point for making healthy buildings. We've seen buildings that are ventilated through the facade, through windows, have indoor microbial communities that look more like the outdoors and look less like our own skin and gut microbiomes, which inherently means there are likely to be fewer pathogens in these environments that are directly ventilated. It's always a balancing act with energy, because if you leave a window open in the middle of winter, then you have those penalties too. So this begs for that smart building, that automated building that can also have a strategy to close those windows when it knows nobody's there and it knows the best energy decision would be to close it. So we're working on a project that we call fuzzy wrenches, which is the fuzzy part is the fuzzy logic and machine learning ideas that we see through computational science. The wrenches part is people who own and operate and run buildings, and we're doing that as a microcosm on our campus. And the BTUs for BTUs project is an example. So we're trying to empower the folks who operate buildings with some of the capabilities that some of our scientists in our data science initiative have with fuzzy logic and machine learning.
When you talk about healthy buildings, you're talking about mental health as well as physical health, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, we look at some of the declines in life expectancy, and the root is often mental health concerns. And so access to views of nature have been shown to provide what we call micro-restorative experiences. Researchers at Michigan several decades ago brought that idea to our lexicon. One of the challenges with healthy buildings, and why I think, as Ranking Member Meadows described previously, is this being elusive in some ways, is that we don't have great metrics for defining what is a healthy building. In energy, we've got energy use indices. For healthy buildings, we are starving for that sort of basic unit of like environmental and mental health. And perhaps the closest thing we have is occupancy rates, but that's not an imperfect metric as well. So that's where I reference the need to develop some metrics of these non-energy benefits.
Thank you. I would ask the two of you who represent different kinds of certification, if you would address the types of buildings or projects that you are involved in, so we know that you're kind of working in tandem as opposed to competitively and in conflict. Would you, because I understand you do different kind of projects and different kind of buildings, that some are more appropriate for LEED, some may be more appropriate for what you do, Dr. Russell. Is that accurate?
Thank you, Chairwoman. There are, I can speak to LEED and let Mr. Russell speak to Green Globes, but LEED has many adaptations now. I believe we're over 20 adaptations for different building types. So a wide range from, certainly we started with office buildings, but now we have customized rating systems for things like data centers that can be large energy users. Things like museums have been certified under LEED. Certainly, green schools are a major element that we've used, as well as residential of all sizes. So we've been really adapting and getting market feedback, and over the last 5 or 6 years, creating those specialized systems to meet a full range of building types.
We typically do actually very similar type buildings. It's just the way we address them is probably a little bit different in that for Green Globes, the main way that we deal with the different types of facilities such as warehouses, data centers, VA hospitals and things like that. We'd use a lot of our not applicable type criteria. And so the main Green Globes criteria covers all the important aspects. And then working with the assessor, we determine, for example, if a certain aspect would not be applicable to a warehouse. We use the NA so that those features do not impact the overall score rating, and the building still gets the sustainable criteria that it's actually earned. So.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is it Beardsley? Is that correct? Ms. Beardsley, let me come to you. When you're doing the LEED certification, is there a different criteria for a building, the same building in Florida as there is in Michigan?
Thank you. Yes, that's correct, Ranking Member.
So there is a different criteria.
I'm sorry. The criteria are the same, and the idea is that...
Why would they be the same?
So the idea is that when you see a LEED certification, you know that it stands for the same performance.
But since this is, you guys are the experts. I just build the buildings. Let me tell you the problem with that, and it gets to the fundamental question of why we need more flexibility in terms of the way that we actually quantify that. Actually, when we look at, you're solving in terms of energy efficiency for two different things, either heating load, HVAC, or lighting load. All right, and so that's why you have windows, and yet when you look at a building in Michigan versus a building in Florida, you will have two very different criteria that you should be solving for, and yet we have a one LEED standard that actually will make you build a less energy efficient building in one of those two environments. Would you agree with that?
Thank you for the chance in restating the question, Ranking Member. So the criteria are the same in the sense that across the categories of LEED, we have prerequisites. Those apply to all buildings. Those are very baseline so that you know.
And they're a point system. I get that.
Right.
All right.
So then within the point system, project teams choose the points and the credits that are most applicable to their building. So we do have buildings that use natural ventilation and don't necessarily have mechanical systems if the climate is suited to that. We have other systems that might use daylighting, and others might use a much smaller.
No, I get that. I guess what I'm saying is there's a lack of flexibility when it comes to those standards. In my opinion, having built buildings in different geographical location, which by its very definition of the way it's structured right now, makes you build a less energy efficient. Because, for example, if you're looking to lessen your lighting load in Florida, you will create a higher building envelope with more windows in doing that, which makes it less energy efficient because your HVAC load goes way up. And so you end up spending more on energy than you would just because you have a very naturally lit environment. And I guess my encouragement to you would be to look at recommendations that we could either do legislatively or provide greater flexibility. So the example that Dr. Russell was putting in terms of a museum or an art gallery is applicable, but it's also applicable when you're not talking about necessarily use. You can say a commercial building for the same exact use, a federal building in Florida should be designed differently than a federal building in Michigan. Wouldn't you agree with that?
And they are, and this is where the integrative design that Mr. Kampshire spoke about comes into play.
So you think LEEDs has enough flexibility to allow to do that? Because I would challenge you on that. That's you're talking to someone who's actually done it. And so you're saying LEEDs gives you enough flexibility, enough point system to give you that flexibility, because I think a federal footprint will be almost exactly the same, because what they will do is not take in the geographical differences.
Sir, I believe that the LEED system does provide flexibility. We've worked hard to increase flexibility in the system, and through the energy model and integrative design, those kind of trade-offs and balancing can be made between whether to get more
And those
energy.
are based on scientific modeling.
Yes, through feedback
Okay.
loop on operating.
I'll let you revisit that. Dr. Russell, do you agree with all of her analysis there?
Not completely. For example, Green Globe's, what we reference always is the ASHRAE 90.1 for energy performance, and the ASHRAE 90.1 actually is climate dependent. It sits there and says that each climate district has their own specific criteria. And so when we evaluate a building, we're looking at that specific criteria and how that building complies relative to what the standard is for that location. And so you get a much more, more sustainable building for that location. There are certain criteria, for example, in which we encourage more daylighting, and in certain regions where we don't. And because we recognize because of the solar heat gain coefficient that you get out of that, you don't need to have those type of factors. And so we certainly try to build in that regional.
All right, and I'm out of time, and so with our architect in, is it Oregon? So I'm going to ask all of you if you will give 3 recommendations on how we can take the current rating system and make it more flexible and more efficient as it relates to those, and perhaps look at both leads and other opportunities on rating commercial buildings. If you'll get that back to the chairman, I would appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll look forward to receiving that. I'll now recognize Ms. Davids for 5 minutes. Yes, Ms. Davids has left us, so we'll now go to Ms. McCarsell-Powell.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for coming here this morning. I represent the southernmost part of Florida, the southernmost district, and I believe one of the most beautiful areas, the Florida Keys and parts of Miami-Dade County. And we are definitely ground zero for climate change. And so this hearing, if we can't make advances on ensuring that we have these regulations for our federal buildings, then we won't be able to expect the same investments in commercial and private facilities as well. So I wanted to ask you, Ms. Beardsley, last year, the National Defense Authorization Act required the Department of Defense to assess the flood risk of its facilities and to mitigate those risks. But other non-DoD facilities are not included in this requirement. And I'm concerned about the resiliency of essential federal buildings after hurricanes, specifically, and floods. Buildings that house very important services for my constituents and constituents all over the United States. Do you think that we need to establish a federal flood risk management standard for all federal buildings and infrastructure?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, we would agree that such a standard would be helpful to ensure that there's baseline protection of federal investment as well as life and property across the board.
And so since Mr. Meadows was bringing that up, that different buildings should have different requirements, can you expand a little bit on that? I'd like for you to comment on the questions that he was asking.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, the LEED system does have flexibility and needs to account for what the conditions are facing that building, the climate zone. And I'll note, we also do reference the ASHRAE 90.1 system, which an energy model and energy requirements are based on the climate. With respect to the floodplain, this is where consideration of changing conditions is important, where existing maps may not reflect the conditions that the building will face over its lifetime of 60, 80, 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, and I know that you attended the Paris climate meetings and the talks, do you think that there are any specific policies from other countries that you would suggest we consider here in the United States that we should implement, especially as it pertains to government infrastructure, buildings, facilities?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. The Paris Climate Conference was really quite exciting and a remarkable moment in time. And what we've seen since then is a movement from these high-level commitments towards more action by the countries who are a party to the agreement. Some of the key areas that we're seeing action on relating to buildings include commitments to net zero energy buildings and also interest in net zero carbon buildings. For example, the EU has a directive requiring all new public buildings to be nearly zero energy buildings, and all new buildings, including private, by 2030. Japan has some analogous requirements as well, and some countries are also providing financial incentives to move towards zero energy buildings.
So it is possible. We can do this.
We would agree. Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I realize I have an extra minute. I wanted to ask a quick question of Mr. Russell. What has been your experience working with the GSA, and what have been the chief obstacles that the GSA or other agencies have faced in pursuing Green Globe certification?
I've greatly enjoyed working with the GSA. I use a number of the GSA resources, such as the SF Tool website, and, to provide education to our various clients, various project teams on really good sources of where you can find good materials, what are good methods, different techniques they can do to help make the projects more sustainable. And so I really haven't had much of a problem in working with GSA. As far as obstacles, the biggest thing is probably more familiarity working with Green Globes and recognizing that we're a viable option out there, and to recognize, that it's a great resource to consider. So.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Pence?
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus. Thank you, panelists, for all being here today. As I mentioned in the first panel, it's my understanding that nearly half of the federal buildings managed by GSA are over 50 years old. If we are serious about improving the efficiency of federal buildings and reducing costs, we need to find solutions for new, efficient buildings given limited funding. In 2016, Congress passed the Federal Asset Sale and Transfer Act. FASTA identifies opportunities for the federal government to sell underutilized property, generating capital by getting rid of some of these old, inefficient buildings. We should also be looking at public-private partnerships, or P3s. Not only do P3s shift liability to the private sector, but utilizing P3s would ensure efficiency is built in and maintained long-term. Dr. Russell, with limited dollars available for new construction and major renovations, and the overwhelming amount of old buildings in our inventory underutilized, do you believe P3s could help energy efficiency savings?
Mr. Pence, yes, definitely. P3 has a lot of potential for assisting with that. I have over 12 years of actual construction experience, and one of the things I learned pretty fast from the construction standpoint is, as the person who's designing or building the facility, I don't have that much incentive to actually continue to make it more sustainable, push above and beyond what's being required. It's that maintenance side where you really start to recognize the savings. And so by combining that maintenance side along with the person who's actually building it, you can actually get a building that really does save energy over a long period of time. And so by encouraging those type of design, build, maintain, or build, operate, transfer, there's a number of terminologies that will come out of the P3, it becomes very beneficial for those type of things, because now you're getting a contractor who is dedicated. They recognize they need to save the operating money if they're going to make money off of in the long term on that project. And so I think it's a fantastic resource. A number of other countries have looked into it, but the problem with it is you run into some unique financial conditions. There's been a lot of research over the last 5 years into difficulties in using P3 and how do you establish the correct parameters for monitoring it so that the contractors can work to the highest benefit, and yet it doesn't waste a lot of government funding. And so I think with proper parameters, I think P3 is a good way to proceed.
So on an efficiency point of view, do you think we should look at P3s with our older buildings that we're releasing like we just did recently? Would we save money operationally and be more energy efficient?
You can if the contract is set up properly. If the contractor recognizes that they're going to see the cost savings and they're going to make more profit essentially by making it more sustainable based upon the way you establish the financial model based on the operating cost, you can encourage the contractor to do that. And if you don't set it up properly, no, you're not going to see that much of a change. And so it really requires some more detailed analysis of what is the proper contract language that's going to attract contractors who are good at making it more sustainable and recognize the investment.
And you're referring to existing buildings that we could turn?
Yes, you could definitely do that with existing buildings also.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Beardley, you wrote in your closing paragraph that funding could drive increased efficiency and resiliency in retrofitting or replacing aging facilities. Are there other solutions other than P3s to address our lack of capital funding to make buildings more efficient?
Thank you, Congressman. There are a number of different public-private partnership models that can be used to advance resiliency and save money. So there's performance contracting. There's also utility energy savings contracting and other P3 models. I think GSA uses a number of different models in its contracting, ranging from design, build with option to buy, design, different kinds of lease, build to lease, build to suit, and other models. So really all of these different contracts can be used with a resiliency lens and an efficiency lens to save money and to set up, a modern federal portfolio for the future.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I yield my time.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Holmes Norton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I am particularly interested in the inventory of the federal government because the most valuable inventory is in my own district, the nation's capital. I've just spoken with our ranking member. He and I share an interest in selling buildings that simply cannot be made usable. I should indicate, however, that we don't want to do a lot of leasing or any more leasing than we have to, so we value old buildings to the extent that we can make them usable. Now, the federal government does have a number of old buildings because, and especially those here in the nation's capital. I'm not talking about those that are no longer usable and should be sold. But what are the most important steps that should be taken first in making old buildings usable? What I'm really speaking to is how these must be the least energy efficient buildings here. And so one of the things the federal government is going to look at is not only is it worth renovating it, but making it energy efficient, or it certainly should be looking at it before deciding whether to sell it or whether to renovate it, which might help us also because we don't want to do any more leasing than possible. Actually, Mr. Russell, or any of you who have a view on that, I'd be interested in.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'll answer very briefly and defer my time. What I think is most important about existing buildings is, especially older existing buildings, is the investments have already been made in many regards, and especially if they're over 50 years old, they probably have good bones, as we say, and they probably have reasonable access to natural light and ventilation through the facade. The trick will then be to create these hybrid new buildings that are not completely leaky at the facade and have thin exterior skins. So the first piece I would recommend.
Well, those will be buildings, they're probably more solidly built.
That's right.
Than any buildings we're building today.
So it's likely looking at the envelope, looking at windows in particular, reducing loads, and then looking at ways to downsize the existing systems when we replace mechanical heating and cooling. Thank you.
Did you have any view, Mr. Russell?
There's been a number of research papers and articles provided to go through exactly that process. I did some research projects when I was at University of New Mexico several years ago, in which we were analyzing various older buildings and what is the most cost-effective way to make those differences. Now, fortunately, agent groups like NAHB, National Association of Home Builders, AGC, and they have come out with actually guidelines that help the average building owner with that process. And so as Dr. Wimmelberg had mentioned, you start with the building shell, and then you proceed on through the basic systems, like simple things you can do to your house even. Make sure all your doors are properly sealed, your windows are properly sealed, get rid of all those thermal bridges, and enclose your facility as much as possible, keep it weather tight, and then just upgrade the performance of your individual components within that. And,
You find that the federal government understands what you just said in terms of its older buildings? Those are pretty simple things.
Yep, exactly. And then the nice thing is they're simple things, and the basic things that cause the biggest change are actually the most economical. And so the key is you start by going through the basic elements before you get into more complex.
Are you finding that the federal government is doing what you're doing, those basic things, especially with these older buildings?
I think if they have the funding, if they have the, it depends upon the agencies themselves. If they see the commitment to that, then I've seen for some DoD projects, definitely. They're trying to make that happen.
I just like to find out at the next hearing if we're doing these simple things first.
Yep.
Seems to me we could be saving the federal government a lot of money. I do have a question I'm trying to find out about continuity. And I know there's some discrepancy between the parties on climate change, but I don't think there's any discrepancy on saving money. And therefore, I want to ask about the difference between, and I asked an earlier question on the executive order from this president and what was previously in existence. Because if administration says one thing and the next administration undoes it, then I think we're all headed to hell when it comes to climate change. So there were guidelines set forth by the Council on Economic Quality's implementing instructions. That's really important, implementing instructions. They implement President Trump's executive order. Are they different from the guidelines which existed from the Act, the Energy Independence and Security Act? I'm trying to find out, are they a substantial enough departure from those old standards to create a meaningful change in the energy footprint of federal buildings? Yes, ma'am.
Delegate Norton, thank you for the question.
You're going to have to be brief.
Yes. So essentially, there have been Congress has been involved in these federal targets for a number of years, but the statutory guidelines have expired now. And with the new executive order and the implementing instructions, it does leave a lot of discretion with the agencies. So it will remain to be seen how the agencies implement that and as they set each annual target, as you heard from Mr. Kamsher.
Thank you very much. It's all in implementing a statute, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can get some reports from some of the different agencies of how they're implementing it. We now go to Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to go back to questions raised by Mr. Pence about the age buildings and what we do about those. I do think modern engineering standards, construction standards are high quality. I appreciate the architectural designs of the older buildings, but in terms of resiliency, I think what we're building now is in many respects superior to what we had. The thing about the older buildings and the problem that the federal government has is underutilization, which I think, or no utilization at all, increases our cost. And I addressed that with our first panel. But Mr. Russell, when you're talking about utilization, you're really talking about reducing the square footage per person. And you want to talk a little bit about how that impacts the operating cost of a facility if you're backing more people into a smaller space?
So by reducing the square foot per person, there can be multiple different effects of that. And so from a straight energy standpoint, if you can reduce the square footage, then naturally you're going to reduce your operating cost. But at the same time, if I increase the number of people in a space, I'm going to increase my level of CO2 levels as people are exhaling. You're going to make a little bit more difficult as far as, you know, we tend to like to have a little bit more space for ourselves. And so from the well-being standpoint, I tend to think it's not going to be as comparable. And so there's kind of a good and bad to it. It's not a definitive answer.
That's my point. You're juxtaposing health against energy savings, other savings, lowering our cost. I think there was one study for a building out in Denver that showed that reducing the square footage per employee to about 165 square feet would save a little over $2 million. But it creates other problems, not just exhaling CO2, but there are other things that might be in what's being exhaled. We've also got issues here with our federal buildings where we have rodents that, you know, you talk about some of the you have what? She's got a pet mouse, is that right? It's a pet now. But we've got some of those issues, and when we talk about asthma rates and things like that, the CDC and others admit they don't really know what causes asthma, but they do know things that create problems, particularly in low-income housing, but also in buildings like the ones that we occupy, where you've got mice and other issues. That has to, I think, be part of when we're talking about consolidating or better utilizing these buildings, because you can mitigate some of those problems by going into a renovated facility and maybe disposing of the older facilities, and by that I mean selling or leasing. You want to address any of you?
So I'll address it briefly. Thank you. I think when you look at utilization, I would recommend starting with leased facilities and prioritizing owned facilities, getting out of leased facilities whenever possible. I also think that we could benefit through an optimization of leased facilities by thinking about which buildings are supporting greatest human health. And right now we have a lack of information. Mr. Kamsher gave a great list of metrics around performance improvements in federal facilities. And when it came to health, I think what we've done often is relied on satisfaction as our metric for health. And it's a good start, but it's not sufficient. We need to build a more robust suite of metrics for documenting health. And I think that can serve as a lens for this optimization. Thank you.
I want to address something Ms. Holmes-Norton brought up about some of these older buildings in Washington. There's also a value architecturally and historically in that. And it may make sense that in making a determination what to do with the building, rather than have a 132-year-old building 6 blocks from the White House boarded up, it might make sense to sell that to someone else who will make better use of it and preserve that building. Madam Chairman, I'd like to introduce to the record the GAO report on space utilization, if we could do that. But I just think when we look at this, it's a broader issue, not just reducing our energy consumption costs, but also making a decision about how we best use our properties and reduce the need to lease. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Fletcher.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. And I do think this is an interesting discussion, and appreciate the comments from my colleagues about how we're prioritizing and what the issues are that we're considering. And obviously, efficiency is important, but I'm interested in this conversation about the metrics that we value. And coming from Houston, a city that's fairly new, I personally walk around Washington and wonder at the incredible architectural value of these buildings that we work in, and that we get to come to work in these buildings every day. And I think there is a value that we place on the facilities in Washington and around the country with some of the older facilities. So certainly I'm more interested in the metrics that we can look at besides age, and also the improvements that we can make. And so I was interested in the conversation about what are the things that we can do to make our buildings more energy efficient when we recognize that there's a value. Certainly I don't think anyone's suggesting that we wouldn't keep the buildings that we're currently in. But the discussion about, looking at the envelope, looking at the windows, or doing some simple things like, sealing at the exterior of the building. I think what would be helpful to us is a sense of what are the other metrics we can look at as a shorthand for, the idea of whether we're in leased buildings and getting out of those makes sense to me. But as we're evaluating these assets, knowing where we can make improvements, I think would be a useful factor. And one thing I want to ask specifically, one of you mentioned the cost of an effort in improving and replacing the existing systems, the mechanical heating and cooling systems. So recently, there was a survey that was supposed to come out, a study in September that came out in May from the National Institute of Standards and Technology on the economic and environmental benefits of gas versus electricity in homes. And I'd be interested in kind of your thoughts and feedback on increasing the use of natural gas in some of these buildings versus electric, if that's one of the things when we're talking about replacing existing systems where you see room for improvement.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I have to note that Texas is one of the top states for LEED in 2018, the number 5. Very good. So I do want to point that LEED has a system for existing buildings to provide a way to approach these buildings, which can be more challenging to bring up to highly performing energy and water efficiency, indoor air quality. And GSA does have experience with that system. For example, here in DC, there's the Treasury Building, an iconic historic structure that achieved LEED Gold in 2011 and has been reported at saving about $3.5 million a year in utility costs. So that's a good success story. We favor and encourage a whole building approach that looks at all of the systems, the envelope, in combination with the needs, what are the user's needs for the building, and make sure that those are aligned, and then create a structured plan to implement the improvements that are needed. That may include gas, it may include electric, it's really site-specific. It may also depend on resiliency goals and the grid and the vulnerabilities of that location. So these are all considerations for dealing with existing buildings and improving them over time.
Thank you.
I would like to offer one answer to 2 parts of your question each. So in terms of what other metrics we might be considering, one that I think would be a great start is looking at how a building is occupiable when there is no power. So how much of the floor area is daylighted and has access to outside air? So many of our buildings, if there's no power, we have to leave them, and this is tragic. The other is a technology. You asked about what technologies in particular for existing buildings, and I'll offer one that continues to bear fruit, which is lighting. There's some new innovations with what's called luminaire level lighting control that I think can start to stitch together some of our conversations today. One around it can help reduce energy consumption substantially by having a distributed sensor network of occupancy and daylight harvesting sensors on each light fixture. It's a retrofit technology, and you can start to understand your space utilization because each sensor triggers when a person walks by and it knows how occupied or unoccupied certain spaces would be, and it might help with the space prioritization. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I can offer, Green Globes also does an existing building program, but one of the things that we do that works really well relative to your question is with the guiding principles compliance, it actually requires when you're doing evaluations to do what's called life cycle assessment and determine does it make sense. Just because you may have a certain efficiency HVAC system and there's a newer efficiency one that comes out, doesn't mean you need to immediately replace that. You need to look at the overall cost of it and determine what is going to make the best sense for the operational cost, the overall long-term efficiency of that. And so when doing that analysis to determine the best thing, we always recommend to our clients, do that analysis. What's the lifespan, what's the operating cost that's going to come out of that, what's your new upfront cost to determine what's the best way to proceed.
Thank you very much. I see I've gone over, so I will yield back. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. I appreciate you doing the shout out to Texas, Ms. Beardsley, but you might have mentioned how great Nevada is and all of the wonderful projects in Las Vegas, including in the private sector with the MGM. Okay, just put that on the record. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been very interesting. Oh, you're back. All right, I'm sorry. Okay, well, now, before I get to that, we'll now hear from Ms. Miller.
Registering. Okay, good. Thank you. One thing that I've not heard anyone mention, which to me is real basic common sense and costs anywhere from $5 to $100, is providing a green plant, you know, a tree or, you know, a scheffalera or, you know, any number of things that use carbon dioxide. That's very basic in helping keep a healthy office. But I'll get on to a little more important questions. Mr. Let's see if I can do it. Why Mellenberg? I got it, okay. Can you further explain the mission of the Build Health program and the role of resilient design and energy efficiency?
Sure, thank you. Well, first about trees, I agree. There is a measurable clean air delivery rate associated with trees indoors. It's marginal, it's not gigantic, but every little bit helps. And
emotionally as well. I mean,
and emotionally and from a biophilic standpoint, I couldn't agree more. Yeah. The Build Health program is founded on the premise that academics don't know everything. Did you hear that?
I did.
Academics don't know everything, and that we really
Could you repeat that again?
And that industry is really essential. We believe by working with industry, we'll ask smarter questions, and that the work that we do together with industry-guided research will be more easily taken up and implemented into practice. And that's the founding principle for Build Health. Thank you.
Well, how could you educate other universities on the benefit of working with industries to create programs?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. So first of all, within Build Health, we do have 7 or so other universities that partner with us. So University of Arizona State University, Oregon State University, Harvard School of Public Health, Northwestern, and others, Oregon Health Science University. So in a way, we're doing that by stitching together the expertise that can be brought to bear about improving building health. But I think more broadly, one of the ideas is to take the BTUs for BTUs program and replicate it across other universities, similar to the program that's offered by the U.S. Department of Energy on their industrial assessment centers.
Okay, in your testimony, you recommend a more comprehensive cost-benefit analysis than relying on energy efficiency alone. What are the negatives of relying solely on energy efficiency?
Thank you. So the negatives, I think, are slower progress. The positives of opening the aperture of leveraging that $100 that we spend on employees compared to the $1 that we spend on energy is that if we can link those financial streams, we can create greater good for both health and energy in buildings.
All right, and what are some of the ways in which Congress can help eliminate barriers in practice and to help to develop a cost-benefit analysis plan?
Yes. I think through the leadership that we've seen from GSA and the High Performance Buildings Program, I would love the opportunity to help explore those non-energy benefits, the health and the comfort, so that a few years from now, when Mr. Campshore comes here, there's another set of metrics in that delivery about health outcomes.
Okay, thank you. I yield back my time.
Well, thank you again very much. I think it's been a very worthwhile hearing. Appreciate you all being here and sharing these ideas with us. We have some things now to kind of get our arms around and work towards, so you'll probably be hearing from us again. As we do that, we'll need your help. I'd ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided any answers or any information that may be submitted to them in writing. And unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. No other members have anything to add? We're good? Then the committee stands adjourned.